Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar today, which is Payroll Year End Part 1, where we'll be focusing on installing the update and getting everything ready for your year end. Now, we do also have our Payroll Year End Part 2 sessions kicking off later today, and in those sessions we'll take you through the full year end process from start to finish. And just so you're aware, we are running some additional themed webinars covering some of the most common payroll year-end topics. So things like directors NI, starters and leavers, and even the new SSP legislation. So we do have plenty of support available to help you through the busy season. My name is Sarah, and as you can see, I'm joined today by Duncan, and we'll be co-presenting the webinar today. Now, Duncan will be back a little bit later on. Let's take a look at what we'll be covering. So I'll start us off with an introduction. So some payroll year-end key dates and deadlines that you'll need to be aware of. And then I'll take you through installing your year-end update along with some top tips just to make sure that installation goes as smooth as possible. I'll then pass you over to Duncan, who will go through preparing for your year-end. So this one's mainly about actually completing your final payrolls for 2025-26 and making sure everything is in place so you're at a point where you're ready to process your payroll year end. Then we'll look at some common questions. So me and Duncan will go through some common Q&As that we get at this time of year. And as always, we'll finish off with some additional support and some time at the end to try and answer as many questions as we can. So let's get started with an introduction. So I do just want to start off by running through some of your payroll year-end key dates and deadlines. So right now, the update is optional and that was released on the 23rd of February. Now, it will become mandatory in early March. So if you haven't actually installed the update by then, and you're not on the latest version already, you will be prompted to install it before you can actually log into your payroll. So if you do prefer to manage that update process yourself, try and get that installed as soon as you can. Now, after actually installing the update, your next key date that you want to be aware of is, of course, the 5th of April, which is going to be the last day of your current tax year, 2025 to 26. So by that date, you should have ideally completed your final payroll for the year and submitted your FPS for that final pay run. So your last pay date of the year will be processed no later than that date of the 5th of April. You've then got the 6th of April, so that marks the start of the new tax year. So any pay date falling on or after the 6th will fall into your 2026-27. And if we look a little bit further ahead, there are some important deadlines that you're going to want to be aware of. So you've got the 19th of April. So that's the deadline to make your final submission for the tax year. So that's the submission that's actually part of your payroll year end process. And then you've got the 31st of May. So that's the deadline to actually issue your P60s to all of your employees who are employed by you on the 5th of April. So just something to bear in mind, these are deadlines. There's nothing to stop you completing these tasks earlier. In fact, if anything, we encourage you just to get everything finalised and to get your year end sent off as soon as you're ready. But remember, we will be walking you through the full year end process in part 2 of this webinar series. And we've got the first one of those kicking off later today. So today, we'll focus on installing the update in this session and preparing for your year end. So everything you need to complete before your final pay date of the tax year. Then in part 2, we'll take you through getting ready for the full year end process and getting everything set up and ready for your 2026-27 tax year, including the new legislation. So those are your key dates and what we'll be working through today. Let's move on to actually installing the year-end update. So to help you get ready to install the update, we've put together a bit of a best practice checklist. So just a few simple steps just to help make sure everything runs smoothly. And don't worry if you have already install the update, and if you've maybe not done a couple of these steps, you can still install it without following the checklist. These tips are simply there just to help prevent any potential issues and give you the smoothest install possible. So first item on the list is optimizing your data. So think of this as giving your payroll a little bit of a spring clean. So the optimize routine will rebuild all of the indexes in your database, and it compresses it. So essentially it reduces the amount of disk space that it uses. So it doesn't change or remove any of your payroll data. It just helps to reduce the size of your backups and helps to maintain organized error-free data, which all in all is going to improve the performance. So next up, we recommend checking your program directory. So this is simply making a note of the location that you're going to find under help and about. And you'll need that a little bit later on in the installation process just to confirm which files are actually being updated. Next, we want to check that automatic updates are switched on. So that's going to allow Payroll to look for updates in the future, and it's going to prompt you when new versions are available. Something to bear in mind with this one is that some external factors, so things like antivirus or firewalls, can sometimes interfere with automatic updates. But don't worry, you can also download it directly from the Help Centre if you need to. And then finally, we'll make sure, and we will be mentioning this a couple of times today, as we normally do, you do want to make sure that you back up your payroll data. So really important, this one, ideally you do want to save your backup somewhere external, so maybe a USB stick or cloud location like OneDrive. Backups obviously are important all year round, but especially if you're doing something like an installation and your year end. If anything unexpected happens, fingers crossed it doesn't, but if your computer crashes, for example, your backup just means that your data is going to be safe and you can restore it and just pick up from where you left off. Another quick top tip there is just you do want to name your backup something quite clear. So for example, before you install the update, you might call it something like pre-install backup. That way you're just going to know exactly what it contains and when it was taken as well. So those are all of your steps to prepare for installing the update. Let's bring this to life in a demo. So I'm just going to bring the slides down. So first step on the list is optimizing your data. Now, this is something that you're going to see whenever you open your program before you log into a company. So you can see the optimize button just down at the bottom there. Now, you can't actually optimize a company that you're currently logged into, so it is best to do this before you actually log into your data. So I'm going to select my company before I log in, and I'm simply just going to click on optimize. And you can see Payroll is going to do all of the hard work for you. Just takes a couple of seconds, and then you'll see the message confirming that the data has been successfully optimized. And easy as that, that is step number one done. And I can go ahead and log into my company. Now, next step on our list is checking our program directory. So once Payroll loads up, close that down. So to check my program directory, I simply just want to go to Help, just up at the top of my Payroll, and down to About. That's going to load up my support page. And we're looking at the program details section. So just this one in the top left here. And it's specifically this first bit here that we want to pay attention to. So this is where the program directory is located. So you can see mine shows that it's on the C drive, in my program files x86, and in my Sage Payroll folder. So I would just want to make a note of that somewhere, jot it down, and you will need that a little bit later on when the installation is checking which files to update. And again, fairly easy one that, so that's step 2, all complete. So next thing I want to check is my automatic updates. I want to make sure that they're switched on, and you can find this under Tools. So I'm going to go to Tools right up at the top, and I'm going to go down to Internet Options. Now, just a bit of a heads up on this one. You do need to have an internet connection for this part. So want to be in this first tab here for software updates, and that's where you're going to see your preferences. You can see mine is set to automatic, which is what we recommend. And this just means that Payroll will check for updates for you, and it's going to prompt you when there is something new to download. So if you haven't installed the latest update yet, you'll see a pop-up when you open Payroll asking if you want to download it. Quick reminder, remember if you do have things like antivirus or firewalls that interfere with those, you can always download the update from the Help Centre instead. Now you can also switch to manual, and instead of the prompt popping up on screen automatically, that just means you can go to Help and then check for updates, and that will trigger the check manually instead. Now, just a reminder, when the update does become mandatory, this setting is overridden. So whether you're set to automatic or manual, either way, Payroll's going to prompt you to install the update before you can actually access your company. And that's just a bit of a safety net there to ensure that everyone is staying compliant and is going to be ready for their year end. Now, another thing that you might want to check, so again in Tools, is if your background updates are on as well. So I can see I've got a nice tick there, mine are on, and that is what we recommend. And this just means that we can actually update the product with any product improvements or any minor bug fixes whilst Payroll is closed. So that just means there is nothing that you need to do with those ones. So I can confirm that mine are turned on. That's all looking good. And then finally, we have taken our backup. And as you all know, you will be prompted several points throughout your normal payroll processes to take backups. But again, you can also do it manually at any time. So I'm going to go File just in the top left. And I'm going to go down to Backup. That opens up my backup wizard. And I'm going to go ahead and take a backup now as part of my preparation steps. So just going to continue through the wizard. And I'm going to save this in my backups folder on my OneDrive. And remember, I am going to rename it something clear, just so I know exactly what point it is I'm taking. So I'm going to put pre-install backup 26, 27. I'm going to finish. And I can see that backup has been successful. So my data is backed up safely somewhere else. And again, that is especially important during your installations. Just if anything unexpected happens, then your backup's there as a bit of a safety net. So those are your 4 best practice steps, just to make sure that your update is going to run smoothly. So I do want to move on now to actually downloading your update. So again, if you've got automatic updates switched on, like we've seen in the demo, the window you can see on the slide is exactly what's going to appear when you open up Payroll and a new update is available. So it's going to prompt you to download and install it right away. But remember, if you prefer, you can manually trigger it by going to Help and check for updates if you've got that preference selected. Third option, to download it directly from the Help Centre. And that update is readily available on the Payroll Year-End Hub, and we've linked at the bottom of the slides there as well. So make sure to get the handouts downloaded if you are wanting those handy links. Now, whichever route you do choose to take once the update has downloaded, you do want to make sure that your Sage 50 Payroll and any other Sage products that you have open, you want to make sure they're fully closed before you begin the installation. If anything is still open, don't worry about it. You will just get a message prompting you to close programs before continuing with the installation. The installer won't actually run until everything is closed. So after that, you'll be able to run the downloaded file. It'll be an exe file. And then you'll see the installation message that you can see on the left there. So first message you'll see is simply just asking you to accept the license. So you just click accept my license to move on. And the next screen will confirm your program directory. And this is the reason why we recommended noting it down earlier. You just want to make sure that the installer has detected the correct location for your Sage 50 payroll. Now, if the file path shown is correct, which you can see in my case it is, then you can go ahead and click yes to continue. Now, if it wasn't correct and there was a mismatch, you would just click no, and then you'll be prompted to browse to the folder and the location that you noted down earlier. And that's why having that program directory handy is really important. Now, once you confirm the directory, the installer will take over and it'll run through the update automatically. So nothing else that you need to do at that point except wait. Now, installation only usually takes a couple of minutes, but it can depend on the speed of your computer and a few other factors. So it is just really a waiting game at that point. But just while we're on this screen, I do want to mention a couple of troubleshooting tips, just in case you do run into any issues. So you do want to make sure you run the installation file as administrator. Now, it should do this automatically, but you can do this by right-clicking and running as admin. And that just allows Payroll to install everything it needs at the highest level of permission. Now, if you do have problems with antivirus, you can maybe try temporarily disabling your antivirus software. If you do run into any issues, just while you're doing the update, and of course, remember to turn it back on afterwards. If you run into any error messages while you're running the installation, best thing you can do with this one is just take a note of it. So that's word for word, including any error codes or numbers. You want to then type that message into the help center. 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a step-by-step support article explaining exactly what it means and how to resolve it as well. So just a top tip there if you do run into any issues. So once the update has installed successfully, you'll see a confirmation message letting you know that it has been updated. Now, it does advise you to save any work and to restart your PC. Now, don't worry, you don't need to do that right away, but my recommendation would just be to restart it when you get a chance, maybe at the end of the day when you're logging off. But with all of that said, that is the update fully installed. Now, a couple of bits just to check after installing the update. So once you log back into Payroll, when you open the program and sign into your company, Payroll will automatically update and optimize your data. So the message you can see just on the right there on the slide is exactly what will appear. So it's just letting you know that your company data is being upgraded to version 32. Once you're fully logged in after the data upgrade, you'll then go to help and about and just double check your version number. Always best to do this just to be on the safe side. So you just want to make sure that it's going to show version 32 or later in there. And then if that's a version you see, your update has indeed installed successfully. Now, before I pass you back over to Duncan, just for the next section, I do just want to take a moment to mention network installations as well. So if you have colleagues who also use Payroll, and if the software is installed on multiple computers, then you do want every single computer that has Payroll installed to be updated to version 32. And here's why. So once the first computer updates to version 32 and logs into the company data will be upgraded to version 32 as well. So if another colleague tries to open Payroll on a machine that hasn't been updated and is still running version 31, they'll see an error message just like the one on the slide. Can look a little alarming, but there's nothing to worry about. All it means is that the company data is now on version 32 and it can't be opened now using an older version. And the fix for this one is really simple. So everyone who uses Payroll simply just needs to install version 32 update so that all machines are running on the same version. So if you're working in a networked environment, it is important that all users update before trying to access that company. And that does bring us to the end of the installation section. So next, I will be passing you over to Duncan, who is going to run through the steps to prepare for a successful year end.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So you've seen there the first stage of your payroll year-end process, and that's to install the year-end update. And we do encourage you, as Sarah says, to install that as soon as you're able to. Now, what you'll then need to do is to prepare for year-end, and all of the steps that I'm going to go through are all centered around completing your final pay runs of the current tax year, 2025 to 26. So we're going to work through a 5-step checklist. So let's take a look at those steps now. Now, step number 1 only applies to you if you run a weekly, fortnightly, or 4-weekly payroll, and that is to check if you will have a week 53 this tax year. If you pay all your staff monthly, you can ignore step 1, you can move straight on to the second step. Step 2 will be to process and update records for your final pay period of 2025 to 26. So check your calendar now and work out what your last pay date of the tax year will be. Step 3 will be to process any leavers who've left before the 5th of April and have received their final pay. So good time to check if there was anyone earlier in the year that hasn't yet been made a leaver, or anyone that you're paying for the last time on your last pay date of the year. And once you've done your leavers, step 4 will be to submit your FPS for your last pay date of the year in the usual way, and then if required, an EPS for month 12. Last but not least is to ensure that you have an up-to-date backup of your payroll data, so that if anything goes wrong during the year-end process, you would have that safety net, that point to restore back to. So we're going to take a look at some slides and also do some demonstrations for this section of the webinar. And let's kick off with week 53. Now, first of all, let's explain how a week 53 comes about. So it only applies to weekly, fortnightly, and 4-weekly payrolls. And the reason there is sometimes a week 53 is that the number of days in a year doesn't divide into a neat number of weeks. So in 2025-26, the 365 days, as it's a non-leap year. And if you divide that number by 7, you end up with 52 full weeks and 1 extra day. Now, if your pay date happens to land on that extra day, that is when you will have a week 53. Because if you pay weekly, that would become your 53rd pay date of the year. Now, for this tax year, you'll have a week 53 if your usual pay date will land on Sunday, the 5th of April. Now, Sunday perhaps isn't a very common pay date, with it being a non-banking day, and it's important to understand that it's the pay date that counts, so the date that the employees receive their pay, rather than the dates that you're paying them for. To look at this another way, if I show you a tax calendar for 2025 to 26, and you can download tax calendars from our help center, you'll see that the tax year began on a Sunday this year, Sunday the 6th of April. That was the start of week 1. And then if we scroll to the end of the tax calendar, you'll see we've had 52 full weeks, and then we have that 1 extra day. And if your pay date lands on that extra day, that is your week 53. Now, if you have a week 53, there's nothing you need to do differently when you come to process it. So you would set your process date to your last pay date, the 5th of April in that example, and you would enter your payments as usual. But there are special rules around calculation of tax for week 53, and payroll will automatically apply a week 1 calculation. So you don't need to change any tax codes or add the week 1 flag. That will happen automatically behind the scenes. And then once you've completed that final pay run, your week 53, if you have one, you're then ready to think about year end. Now, what can happen in the following tax year if you've had a week 53 is that HMRC issue a P800 notice to employees to inform them if they've underpaid tax. And that's because they've had an extra week of free pay allowance in the payroll, which is completely in line with HMRC guidance. And then they might have a tax code change as a result of that, or they might end up repaying some tax to HMRC. But all you need to be worried about is whether you've got one. Don't process a week 53 if you don't have one, and don't try to avoid one if you do. And you can actually read more about week 53 and how that all works by following the link on the slide. So that's our step one. Now, step two is to process and update records for our final pay date of the year. And for this one, I'm going to give you a demo. So let me just bring the slides down. And we're going to jump into payroll for this. Now, in our demo today, I am running a monthly payroll. So I will never have a week 53. With monthly payrolls, there are always exactly 12 pay dates in the year. And I know that my last pay date of the year will be the 31st of March because I pay my staff on the last calendar day of the month. So I've already set my process date to my pay date, which will be the 31st of March in this example. And when it comes to running the last period of the year, there's nothing that you need to do differently, but something to be aware of is if you have directors on your payroll and you've set them up on the pro rata basis, director status, there will be an automatic recalculation of their national insurance. So I just want to show you where you can check your director status if you do have directors on your payroll. So I've just got one. And if I go into the employee record for my director and select the employment tab, you'll see the director status section is here on the right hand side. And for directors, you will have either selected annual basis, which is where national insurance is calculated on annual earnings and annual thresholds throughout the year, or you'll have selected pro rata basis, like I have. And that's when the national insurance is calculated per period, but is then recalculated with an annual calculation in the last period of the year. So because I've got them on pro rata basis, we're going to see a message pop up when we enter their final pay. So what I'll do next is select my employees in the usual way. And notice that I do have leavers and employees marked on hold in this list. So the employee on hold isn't actually working this period. So I just keep them on hold. I don't need to take them off of hold for the last period of the year or for the year-end process. They remain on hold until the next time I need to pay them. But when I go into enter payments, which I'll do just now, you'll see that as usual, I'll be prompted to deselect employees that have left or are marked on hold. Now, this first employee is our director. So you can see their national insurance amount here at the bottom of the screen. They're just getting their usual salary this month. But when I click onto save/next, I do get this message informing me that they've been recalculated on a year-to-date basis. And I'll explain a bit more about the impact that's had on this director later on in the demo. Moving on to my next employee. This employee is actually on parental leave this month. So they're taking a couple of weeks of statutory parental pay. So they're receiving a statutory parental payment. And this just means at the end of the month, because I'll be reclaiming that statutory payment, I will need to send an EPS. So look out for that later in the demo. For the rest of my employees, I'm just going to check and save their payments in the usual way. So I have some hourly paid and I have others with fixed salaries. And once those payments have been entered, I would just continue with my payroll as normal. So I would run a pension assessment if I use the pensions module. I'd go into my pre-update reports to produce payment summaries and print pay slips if I issue printed copies. And then I could upload online pay slips if I do that through the online services. Now, I'm just going to skip ahead to the update record step. So let's assume I have completed those previous steps. And when I go into update records, I'm going to click yes to continue. Ideal time to take a pre-update backup. So we always recommend you take regular backups when running your payroll. And then once you've done that, you can work through the update records wizard. And then when we complete the update records wizard, you'll see the confirmation message and the usual message advising to deal with your leavers before you send your full payment submission. So that is my last pay date of the year, updated. And if I review the last updated column, that confirms to me that I have updated records for the 31st of March for all of my active monthly paid employees. Now, before I move on to the next step, I did want to come back to the director. So just to explain a bit more about directors' national insurance, the way that it works for directors is that by the end of each tax year, any director must have paid the correct national insurance based on their cumulative earnings and the annual director's NI thresholds. Now, if the director status is set to annual basis, this happens throughout the year. So they don't start to pay national insurance until their cumulative earnings exceed the annual primary threshold. However, if they're on pro rata basis, this means that the national insurance has been calculated using weekly or monthly thresholds throughout the year, in the same way as a non-director, but needs to be recalculated in the final period of the year. And sometimes directors will choose this method because it allows them to more evenly spread out their national insurance payments. Now, the impact this can have, the recalculation, is where there's been any variances in the pay. So I'm going to show you a report for the director that we looked at earlier. So this is just the payment summary history report. And you can see on this report that the employee receives a basic salary of $332,750 each month. But there was 1 month during the year where they also received an annual bonus of £10,000. And at the time, in month 9, you can see there was an increase to both the employee and the employer national insurance. But in that month, the employee's monthly earnings were a lot higher than the upper earnings limit. And the employee would have paid a lot of that national insurance at the reduced 2% rate. Now, come the end of the year, if we look at the employee's annual earnings, they're just under £50,000, which is actually under the upper earnings limit on the annual thresholds. So in month 12, the employee's national insurance has gone up quite considerably. So they're paying a lot more national insurance than they normally pay on their basic salary. And the reason for that is it's been recalculated. So effectively, they're paying the national insurance that was owed on that bonus payment from back in December. Now, the total amount they would have paid would have been exactly the same if they were on the annual basis. It just, because of their director status, it's when that was paid that has changed. So that's why we're seeing a difference in this case. And where the pay does vary from period to period, directors might prefer to be on the annual basis so that there isn't any nasty surprises come the end of the year. Now, if you want to learn more about directors' national insurance, we do run a separate webinar, and we've got a couple of sessions coming up. So do get yourself signed up if you do want to learn more. So let's now move on to our next step. So we're going to rejoin the demo for step 3, where we need to process any leavers that have left before the 5th of April and have received their final pay. So we've updated records for our last pay date of the year. So now's a good time to check that if anyone has previously left, they've already been made a leaver, as typically you would do this immediately after that pay run, or if there's perhaps anyone that's been paid for the last time on that 31st of March pay date. So what I can see in my employee list is that I do have a leaver already who has a current status of leaver, and they actually left in February. So I've already marked them as a leaver as I ran the leaver wizard after I processed their final pay. I also have an employee marked on hold, but they are not a leaver. They're still employed by me. They're a seasonal worker, so they don't work all the year round. And because they're going to come back and work for me at some point in the future, all I need to do for them is to keep them on hold. Now, I don't have anyone that I paid for the last time on my March pay date, but if I did have anyone that was leaving perhaps towards the end of March, but will be paid in April, so if their final pay will be in the new tax year, I can't make them a leaver at this point. I would need to wait until I'd processed and updated their final payment before I came back to run the leaver wizard. We'll cover that again when we look at the common questions at the end. So I've done my checks. I've dealt with all of my leavers for this tax year, So I'm now ready to move on to my next step and submit my FPS and, where required, my EPS. So the full payment submission is sent in the usual way. So I can click on this from my payroll tasks, which is then going to take me into the FPS screen. I'm going to click continue, and it shows the company details, the gateway registration. And then on the next step, I can see that this is being sent for tax period 12, month 12 in this example, and it's showing the usual liability amount and number of employees. What you might also notice that the FPS has a section for final submission for year. And this is currently marked as no, and it will always be marked as no. So although this is my last FPS of the year, with Sage 50 Payroll, you will do a separate year-end submission as part of the year-end process, and it is that submission that will show final submission for year. So nothing to worry about that this is saying no. All I would need to do is to submit the FPS as usual. So that will be sent through to HMRC. And once the submission is complete, we get the submission successful message. You can view the submission log if you wish to. And then as a final check, if I review my last FPS date column, you can see that this is now showing 31st of March, same as my last updated date for all of my current active employees. Now, one other step for me, as this was my last period of the year, is to send an EPS if required. And the most common reason for sending an EPS is where you've reclaimed a statutory payment. Now, it is only statutory parental payments that you can reclaim. If you've paid out SSP, you don't send an EPS because you can't reclaim statutory sick pay. But if I check my P32 report for month 12, which is my final tax month of the year, you'll see that on this report, I do have some SPP recovered, statutory paternity pay, and for that reason, I will need to send an EPS for month 12. So I could do that from the link in the payroll link section, employer payment summary, or I can go to e-submissions and I can click employer payment summary from here. Select the option that I'm adjusting my payment as I've recovered statutory pay. You would also send one if you've suffered CIS deductions or if you're paying apprenticeship levy. And then you would simply work through this wizard, checking the tax month and the amounts recovered for the tax year to date. So this month I'm recovering statutory paternity pay, but this submission will also contain any other statutory payments that I've reclaimed during the tax year, which in this example is some statutory maternity pay that was reclaimed earlier in the year. So this is a year-to-date submission, and it does mean if you forgot to send an EPS earlier in the year, you could always send one for the current period, and that will report the most up-to-date values. So once we've checked these values, you've got the section where you can manually enter CIS deductions suffered if they apply to you, and then the apprenticeship levy values calculated by your software. And then we complete this wizard, which will then prompt us to submit the EPS. So this EPS for month 12, again, is not the final submission for the year. So this is marked as no. And remember, you will do a separate final year-end submission as part of the year-end process, which we're going to cover in our part 2 webinar. So all I need to do is to submit the EPS. And that is then reported to HMRC, and then they can adjust my liability by the amount of statutory pay that I've recovered. So one final step in my checklist was to take a backup of the payroll data. So Sarah showed you this earlier, but just as a reminder, to access the backup wizard, go to your file menu and click backup. Work through the wizard and just back up the files selected automatically, just these standard files. You can browse to a location for your backup and you can give it a name. I'm going to call this one month 12 post update. Then going to click on to save, next, and finish. And I now have my payroll data safely backed up. And if I ever needed to, I could return back to this point by restoring that backup. So just to recap some of those final steps. So we checked if we had any levers that we needed to process. And in my example, I didn't. I'd already done that at the time they left. We then sent the full payment submission, and we noted that this was not marked as the final submission of the year. And because I reclaimed a statutory parental payment, I also did an EPS for month 12, which again was not the final submission. But you will do a final submission as part of the year-end process, which I've highlighted on the screenshot there. And you'll see exactly how that works in our part 2 webinar. So just a quick recap through that checklist. Step 1 was checking if you have a week 53. So only if you pay weekly, fortnightly, or 4-weekly, and your usual pay date will land on Sunday, the 5th of April this year. Second step was processing and updating records for the final pay date of 2025 to 26. We then checked whether we need to process any leavers that have left before the 5th of April and had received their final pay. Step 4 was processing the FPS and EPS for that last period. And the final step you saw there was backing up your data. One last thing to think about when planning for your payroll year end are how you're going to produce your P60s. So the P60 is a statement of earnings for the year with the gross pay and the deductions made. It needs to be issued by the 31st of May, one of the deadlines that Sarah talked about earlier. And as with payslips, there are 3 different ways to produce P60s in your software. So they can be uploaded to online services, either Sage HR or our online bureau portal if you're an accountant. P60s can be emailed, and it uses the same settings as email payslips, or they can be printed, and these days you print it directly onto plain paper. So gone are the days of aligning stationery. We don't provide stationery, nor do HMRC. Far easier if you're going to print them onto plain paper. Now, what we would be interested in knowing is how you are planning to do your P60s this year. So we are going to run a quick poll on screen. So if you'd like to join in, you can select a response to this poll. And the question we're asking is, how do you plan to produce your P60s this payroll year end? So you can select more than one option, because of course you can mix and match for different companies or employees. But are you planning to print your P60s? Will you be emailing the P60s? Are you planning to upload to online services? Or are you not sure? So if you'd like to vote, you can select your options and click on to submit. And we will share the overall results with you before we move on to our common questions. So how do you plan to produce P60s at this payroll year end? So we've had over 80% of the vote in. I'm going to close that poll down now. And for anyone interested, here are the poll results. So the most popular answer are online P60s. So that would be to Sage HR, which employees can access via the mobile app, or to Online Bureau if you're an accountant. Second place, we've got email P60s, so definitely going down the digital route here. And in third place, 31% of you are planning to print them. So really interesting insight that for us. So thank you so much for joining in, and we'll be covering producing P60s in part 2. So that's it for preparing for year end. But we're now going to bring Sarah back as we're going to answer some of your common questions. So back over to you, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Duncan. So before we wrap up, I do want to take a moment just for me and Duncan to go through some of the most common questions that we do get at payroll year end. So first up, we have, can I install the update before I process this month's payroll?
Okay, so great question, and I think we've seen similar in the Q&A today. The answer to this one is yes, you can and you should. It's actually going to become a mandatory update in early March. So it's optional currently, so you've got the choice of when you install it, and it can be installed before processing your final period, as the update will contain legislation settings for both the current tax years and also the future tax year. So it's the process date in Sage 50 Payroll that controls which legislation settings are actually used in calculations. So you're absolutely fine to complete any remaining payrolls in version 32. Reminder, if you have multiple PCs, you do need to install the update on each one. And if you're not sure if you've done it, you can do a version check by clicking Help and About, and you can check your version under Program Details.
Real, thanks so much for that, Duncan. So next up, and again, I do think this has been a popular one in the Q&A, is I have a leaver in March, but they're being paid in April. What do I do?
Yeah, again, really common question around this time of year. I think we alluded to this one in the demo, but the steps for this are that you must process and update records for the final period for that employee before you can run the leaver wizard. So if their leaving date is in March, but they're actually being paid their final pay in April, you'll need to ensure that you've updated records for April before you run the leaver wizard. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you produce the P45, it must contain the year-to-date values for the tax year of their leaving date. So although they've been paid in the new tax year, when you run the leaver wizard, you will need to change your process date back to the leave date in March. You'd then run the leaver wizard and produce a P45, which will show their final payment of 2025 to 26 in the year-to-date values. And once you've completed that leaver wizard and recorded the leaving date, you would then set your process date back to the April pay date before you send your FPS. So leavers, if they've left before the 5th of April, would get a P45, but they do not need to be given a P60.
Brilliant. And we do have our starters and leavers webinar as well running, so definitely get on that if you want to know more. So next up we have, do I need to do anything special in month 12 for my directors?
Right, so although there will be a recalculation for directors on the pro rata basis, you don't need to do anything special. So the recalculation will happen automatically, as it did in the demonstration. If it's set to an annual basis director status, it won't even need to be recalculated, as it's been calculated on a cumulative basis throughout the year. So no, you don't have to do anything special, but a quick tip, if you do need to change a director status, best time to do that is the start of the new tax year, because that will allow you to switch between any of the director statuses, or if the employee ceased to be a director during the tax year, as you move into the new tax year, you could move them to non-director status. But yeah, you don't need to do anything special. Your software will handle that for you.
Brilliant. And a few more questions that we've got. So we've got, we pay weekly. Do we have a week 53?
Yeah, so you need a check because you do pay weekly, but it all depends on what your usual pay date is. So you will only have a week 53 this year if your regular pay date falls on Sunday, the 5th of April. So if your pay date is any other day of the week, you won't have a week 53 this year. Your last payment of the year will be week 52, because the next pay date will be your first pay date in 2026 to 27. If you do have a week 53, the week 1 calculation for the tax is done automatically, so no need for you to change any tax codes. But keep in mind, further down the line, employees may get a P800 notice, might result in a small tax code change as well.
Great, yeah, definitely something to bear in mind, as can cause some alarm bells when those come through, but totally normal for a week 53. Now, we pay a week in arrears. What year does that fall in? Definitely one I've seen in the Q&A as well.
Yeah, so again, the key point to hammer home here is it's the pay date that counts. So it doesn't matter when the work was done. It's the date that the employees receive their pay that determines the tax period and therefore the tax year and the pay date in your submissions. So when you set your process date in Sage 50 Payroll, that records the pay date for those employees. So if your pay date was the 4th of April, for example, that pay date is in 2025 to 26. If your pay date's a Monday and you're paying on Monday the 6th of April, that pay date falls in 2026-27. If your usual pay date happens to land on a bank holiday, and we know Monday the 6th is Easter Monday this year, you should still report that in your payroll. You should still treat it as paid on the usual pay date or contractual pay date, even if you have actually paid your employees on an earlier or later pay date because of the bank holiday. But yeah, it's the pay date that counts in this scenario.
Brilliant. And last one, so we've got, do I take on-hold staff off hold for my year end?
Simple answer for this one, no, there's no need to. If they are not receiving any pay in the final periods of the year, you keep them on hold and they will still get a P60 as part of the year-end process as long as they've worked at least once during the tax year and they've had earnings. So keep them on hold until the next time they need to be paid. As you move into the new tax year, when you send your first FPS of the year, it will pop up asking you to include your on-hold employees in that FPS. And that's something you should do as it reports to HMRC that they are irregularly paid. But you would only take them off of hold the next time they need to be paid. So keep them on hold until then.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Duncan. So that does bring us nicely to the end of today's webinar, but I do just want to run through some further support and some time to make sure we've got all of your questions answered as well. So of course, we do have our year-end part 2 webinar that is kicking off later today at 2 o'clock. And we will be taking you through the payroll year-end process and the steps to get ready for the new tax year, including a bit about what is new for 26-27. Of course, we have our other webinars at payroll year-end. So we've got Directors NI, corrections, but of course one around the new SSP changes. So definitely going to be a big one that. Make sure to get signed up on those if you haven't already. The Help Centre is a really great resource, especially at this time of year. So we have our Payroll Year-End Hub live on there at the moment, where we've got our support guides and info on how to get in touch with the team if you need to. Now, something just to watch out for as well is, of course, the Sage Assistant. So you just want to make sure that you've got all support options available to you at this busy time. So make sure to check that out if you haven't already. Now, we do have some personalised training sessions available. So that is one-to-one sessions with an expert who will support your very own year-end process. And you will be provided with personalised guidance on what needs to be done once your payroll has been processed. So this is a one-to-one service. Charges do apply for it. But if you are interested in knowing more about that, then we have popped a link at the bottom of the slide there. So that's the link to inquire if you are interested. Now, with all of that said, I will be jumping on mute in a second just to help the guys out with any questions that we might have outstanding. If you are leaving us at this point, then you will see a survey. If you do have 2 seconds to fill that out, we do love reading all of your comments. But with that said, let me and Duncan jump on mute and we will help the guys out with any questions, and we'll see you shortly to wrap the session up. Hello again, everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed today's session. I haven't had any new questions come through there, so we'll go ahead and close the session down in the next minute or so. As you leave, you will see a short survey. If you do take a second to fill that out, we'll love hearing what you thought, what worked well, anything that can be improved, so we can keep making these even better for you. You will also get a follow-up email later today. It'll have the link to today's recording on there and links to register for any future webinars. But thanks again from me and Duncan for joining us today. It is goodbye for now.